tobacco has been around for some time, 5,000 years if being specific. The earliest known usage of tobacco was 2,000 years ago when the Native American tribes would smoke it for religious ceremonies and purposes. In 1492, when Columbus came to what is now San Salvador, he observed this behavior when interacting with the natives. In 1513, a few years later, the plant was stored and shipped in barrels back to Europe, but it wasn't until 1531 that it became popular. Many were excited about this drug, particularly Nicolas Mundartis, a Spanish doctor. In the 1570s, he began to recommend the miracle drug tobacco to cure common ailments as toothaches or worms. This was a factor that fueled the demand and prompted industries to begin in the early 1600s. But like most good things, it was too good to be true. In 1602, a doctor who signed his name as Philaretz published a paper theorizing a connection between the effects of sootwort, a common disease found in chimney sweepers, and tobacco. Because the industries were so large, however, he was quickly silenced and his theory swept under the rug. But more powerful people are harder to ignore. King James I himself wrote a paper titled Counter Blaste to Tobacco, in which he condemns and discourages its use, implying that it was a foul habit. Even with the king's influence, in 1665, tobacco smoking was made mandatory in some schools due to the belief that it could protect against the plague. In 1795, despite all the previous evidence and newfound discovery that pipes are related to lip cancer, the industry still grew. We'll begin with the first major event, the Children's Act of 1908. This act prevented children under 16 years of age from buying cigarettes, becoming the first legal action against tobacco. In the 1920s, addictions and suspicions of a connection to lung cancer began to emerge. There were court cases of tobacco industries being sued, but none were won. The peak of tobacco use hit during the World Wars, where troops were supplied with free cigarettes for the purpose of easing and relaxing stressed nerves. Because of the women's involvement in the war, what was once considered a manly drug was being smoked by both genders. By 1949, 39% of women and 89% of men smoked. It had ingrained itself inside the European culture. Then came the harsh reality check. In the 1950s, two scientists by the names of Austin Bradford Hill and Richard Dole successfully proved and confirmed the theory that smoking was hazardous for the human consumption and had a high potential of leading to cancer. Even the chain smoker British Prime Minister at the time acknowledged that while it could no longer be denied or ignored, tobacco was dangerous. While people were now aware of the risks, machines pumped out cigarettes faster than ever before. Old machines had pumped out 200 cigarettes a minute, and the new ones were 45 times as fast, a whopping 9,000 a minute. The multi-billion-dollar industry would not back down, but unlike previous times, there was concrete evidence against them. In the late 20th century, they began to lose their court cases, losing profits in the process. The industries knew they were beaten, so they resorted to a new strategy: third world countries.
After the height of smoking's popularity in the 1920s until the first half of the 1960s, tobacco use began to decline in 1964 when the first Surgeon General's report about the harmful effects of cigarettes was published. This was the first time the public had been fully informed about how dangerous cigarette smoking was, and for the first time in over 40 years, the number of people who started smoking began to decrease each year. The Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act of 1965 required all cigarette packages to have a label that said, "Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health." Just 4 years later, the Public Health Smoking Act of 1969 took away the ambiguous phrase, "may be hazardous," and required all cigarette packages to clearly state, "Warning, the Surgeon General has determined that cigarette smoking is dangerous to your health." The cigarette industry suffered another blow in 1970. Congress formed special committees to draft legislation to regulate the tobacco industry. One of the new laws that came from these committees was signed by President Richard Nixon on April 1, 1970, and it banned all cigarette ads on radio and television. This was a huge blow to the tobacco manufacturers because in 1969, tobacco companies were the single largest product advertisers on television. Despite the new information about the risks of tobacco use, cigarette smoking was still popular in the 1970s and 80s. People were allowed to smoke in most places, including hospitals, schools, restaurants, trains, and planes. As people learned more about the dangers of secondhand smoke, policies began being implemented to limit the places where people could smoke. In 1988, the first ban on smoking on airplanes was implemented, but it only applied to domestic flights of 2 hours or less. By 2000, smoking was banned on all flights, both domestic and international, regardless of the duration of the flight. By the 2000s, smoking cigarettes had definitely lost its widespread appeal. In 2007, the Motion Picture Association of America even began including smoking as one of the factors that would be considered when determining the movie's rating, along with language and violence. Throughout the nation, smoking became actively discouraged. Many states enacted bans on indoor smoking, with California being the first state to do so in 1995. By 2018, 26 states had enacted bills on all indoor smoking, including inside bars and restaurants. At this time, there is no federal law to govern indoor smoking, so it is up to each individual state to decide what is best for their citizens. While cigarette smoking has decreased steadily since the 1960s, a new trend has emerged to take its place. Vaping, which began as a way to help people stop smoking traditional cigarettes, has become a dangerous habit for millions of teenagers. Juul pods were first sold in 2015. Juuls are electronic cigarettes that look like a flash drive and come in fun flavors that appeal to teens. Almost 25% of students in 8th through 12th grade will vape each month. That number is so high that in December of 2018, the Surgeon General declared that vaping among teens is an epidemic in the United States. Juul and other electronic cigarette manufacturers are being investigated by the FDA because their marketing and advertising practices appear to be aimed directly at teens. Many teens are not aware of the risks that are associated with vaping. They don't realize that one Juul pod contains the same amount of nicotine as an entire pack of cigarettes. Studies have found that 75% of teens who vape will eventually start smoking regular cigarettes. Vaping leads to nicotine addiction just like smoking regular cigarettes does. Even more concerning than the physical risks associated with vaping are the psychological risks. Vaping has been shown to increase depression and anxiety and decrease a teen's ability to focus. Dr. Sharon Levy, the director of the Adolescent Substance Abuse and Addiction Program at Boston Children's Hospital, summed up this problem by saying, "I hear kids saying, 'Well, I thought it was safe,' or 'At least it's safer than cigarettes.' But safer than cigarettes is a really low bar."